Good afternoon, friends. Welcome to another Word of Gord. Today we'll continue with our series, Average Folks in the Afterlife. And contrasting, I guess, with some of these more famous celebrity types that we've been talking to. And some of you may not be familiar with this. Been a lot of interest in the Robin Williams channelings of late, so this is a series that preceded that. We're in the middle of it, and it involves reading from a selection of my appallingly large variety of psychic communication books going back through the decades. This one is The Awakening Letters by Cynthia Sands and Rosamond Lehmann, published when? 1978. Not that long ago in that field. And we've read from this book before, and we're going to continue. Cynthia was in communication with a large selection of her family, and these are two communications done with automatic writing, I believe, from her brother, who she called Joe, and is identified as Sir Alvery Gascoigne. Now, isn't it interesting how if I'd said Sir Alvery Gascoigne, you would have had one perception of the chap, and if I call him Joe, quite another. Amazing what names will do. Anyway, this chapter is called The Tycoon. I asked Pat what happens to the millions of people who come over with no one in their entourage to help. Her reply was, "Come and see." So I found myself in a rather rich house with an old man just passing out of his earth body. He had been a real tycoon in industry and very rich. His poor old wife couldn't face life without him. He'd always done everything, and now she was alone. I sensed that they had no children, and he'd been so successful that he'd alienated most of his contemporaries. And there he stood outside his body, a grey, frightened individual, completely alone. I went up to him and spoke some sort of welcome to show he wasn't quite alone. He heard me, looked around the room, and merely grunted, "How the devil did you get in?" I laughed and tried to explain, pointing to his corpse on the bed. "What have you done to me?" was his next remark. "Have you killed me?" "No," I repeated. "You must remember your illness." He nodded. "Well, now you have died according to the doctor, but you see there is no death, only a change of body. How do you feel?" "I don't know who you are, and you have no right to be here. Get out." "Of course, if you say so," I replied, "but then you will be quite alone." "No, I didn't mean that. You can stay. You are only a voice anyhow." Then he began to see me. "Oh, you're not only a voice, you are a man." "Well, how do you see me and my wife doesn't? Can you tell me that?" "Yes," I replied. "You are an etheric now. You have left your physical body forever." "That can't be true. This is just a dream, and a very worrying one, too. I'll wake up in a moment." Then he went over to the bed and tried to overlay his body, but it was cold and repellent. "Can't do it," he said in desperation. "Well, come and help me, whoever you are. Anyway, I'm not dead." But he was so exhausted that I was able to persuade him to lie on a sofa in his own room, and in a moment he was asleep. Later, I went to go back to my tycoon, who I left asleep on the sofa. I knew he would wake before his funeral and need help. So I kept a tab on him, as Pat calls it, and sent out messages to find out his condition. When people began to come into his room, I feared he would wake, and so he did. Looking up suddenly, he saw me and said, "Hello, you are here again. Who the devil are you?" "Not the devil," I assured him, "just a guide to explain and help you deal with this new situation." "What situation?" "Oh, yes, I know you. You said I was dead." "Well, that's a good joke. I'm fine, simply grand, better than I've ever been for years. I haven't woken up as fresh as this for a long time. Wouldn't you like to come outside and have a breath of fresh air, I suggested. No, I'd prefer to stay here. If, as you say, I'm dead, then I'll prove to the wife that I'm nothing of the sort. Well, I said, go and try, but remember you are in a different body now, and she can't see you. Well, that's as may be, but I don't feel ghostly or airy-fairy. I'll have a try. So saying, he got up and started to walk out of the room, swaying badly. I took his arm. What's wrong with me? I have not been drinking, but I can't walk steady. I explained that he had learned to walk with his new body. He had to. Oh, stop all that trash. Here I am just as I was in my old pajamas. There's no change. Well, go on and see, I urged. The door was shut, and he seized the handle and tried to turn it, but his hand slipped off the polished surface, and the effort he made sent him through the door. That shook him. The stairs were the next obstacle. He held on to me and floated down quite comfortably. Like sliding down the banisters as a boy, he murmured. We came to his wife's sitting room. Again the door offered no barrier, but he began to feel uncertain of himself. Hetty, he called as he saw his wife writing letters and crying as she did so. Hetty, don't cry, love, I'm all right. No movement, no reply. He went closer. Hetty, don't you hear me? He shook her arm, or tried to, but again he could get no grip. He yelled into her ear, but she took no notice. He became exasperated. Has she gone daft? Was his next question. No, but you've changed. You've passed through 2 doors, you floated down the stairs, and now you expect her to hear your voice, which has no material vibrations. Go up to that large mirror and breathe on it. Can you see your breath? No, but what am I to do? Thank goodness you are here. I can see you, and you can see me and hear me. Otherwise I'd go mad. Do you know or care for anyone who has already died? I asked him. Oh yes, plenty, but how do I reach them? By thinking of them. Your thought calls them. That doesn't seem sensible, but I'm in a fair do. I'll follow your instructions. I urged him to go out into the garden. I wanted him to get away from his weeping wife. There were some chairs under a tree, and I said, sit down and think. He sat, but not on the chairs. He floated above them and complained that I'd put one of those damned air cushions under him. All the same, he was quieter, and he soon began to think of his old friends. There was George, who died last year. He had a terrible illness. He couldn't be alive now. I said, he is. Just think of him and call him. So he did. George, this is silly, but I'd be right glad to see you. And in seconds the form began to appear of a quite healthy middle-aged man. Oh, George, he gasped. How did you get here? I heard your call, was the simple answer. Have you come over too, Rob? Well, that's great. And for a few moments the 2 old friends compared notes and were so relieved to find each other. I thought I could leave them, but Pat said, no, you've got to see Rob asleep first. Then you can go. Their conversation rumbled on, Rob becoming calmer and more content, and eventually he slept. I turned to George and said, what about you? Are you an established etheric? Well, not quite, but I'm getting accustomed. I'll look after him. Thank you for looking after and helping old Rob. You know, he's not a bad sort, really. Not a bad sort. Anyway, you see the attitudes. Disaster retrievals. I've spoken quite a lot about that in many YouTube videos in years gone past. Here's another version taking place on that island off England called the Isle of Man. I'm not quite sure which one it refers to, but it says here the Isle of Man disaster. And it's long enough ago, I don't think we have to really get wrapped up in the tragedy of it. Although it's easy enough to get wrapped up in the tragedies of our own day. Is it not? I know you are wondering why in the world and throughout the world you are having so many catastrophes. Don't you see the answer? The world has gone completely or almost completely materialistic. They worship money and power on this plane and on the lowest level. and so to break their mad rush, groups of people have to be withdrawn suddenly, so as to shock those who remain into some sort of fear or questing state of mind. Now that's quite a point when you think about it. Spirits saying that we're so materialistic and, what? Selfish, uncaring, unspiritual, that we need disasters to remind us of the real purpose of life. Seems like a harsh lesson to me, but that's just my opinion. And if one thing will come out in this series of readings is that spirits still have a variety of opinions on life, the universe, and everything that happens within it. It's not as if people die and then all suddenly think the same thing. Not so. Continuing. I was in Douglas when this awful thing happened. I believe Douglas is one of the major towns in the Isle of Man. And it was terrific. And if seen from your side only, it was horrific. But there was another side. Flo was there in charge of the children, and she got them away with a rapidity that had to be seen to be understood. She literally ripped off their etheric bodies, like shelling peas, as she put it. Children can be so amazed by being shown a vision that they are quite impervious to physical pain. They allow their consciousness to flow into the exciting beauty which is flung within scope of their vision. And while this moment lasts, the bodies are separated, and Flo took them all far away from the scene in the twinkling of an eye. Good old Flo, eh? But for the anxious parents, it was quite another story. I went with a young couple in search of a child of 4 or 6, who had been left in the children's playroom perfectly happy while they sauntered off elsewhere. Then it happened. Their first thought was, "The child!" and they separated and rushed back by different routes. The mother got theirs first and found the child's body, and in a wave of deep emotion passed out of her own body almost at once, and was able to follow the tiny trail of the child's vibration and catch up with Flo's party, including her own child. She had felt the burning, suffocating power of the fire, but her intense agony over the child had made her indifferent to it, and then suddenly it ceased, and she was free, following a trail that only her finer body could detect. Flo welcomed her at once and placed her own child in her arms, saying, "This is lovely. Now you are together for always." The woman was dazed and delighted beyond words at finding the child well and happy, and saw no change in herself or the child. "Now we must go and find Dad," was her reaction after the relief from this intense anxiety had passed. But here Flo or one of the helpers intervened with, "No, you must stay here with the child. Your husband will join you here. We shall find him." So content for the moment and utterly exhausted by the emotion and all they had been through, both she and the child fell asleep. Tomorrow I'll tell you how we found the father. Now I might add from my own experience of working at disaster retrieval scenes, particularly earthquakes and large sort of floods. One of the most difficult parts of it is not the retrieving of the people, it is dealing with separated families where some have passed and some haven't. And the ones that haven't passed, if there's a spouse and children gone over and they haven't, we desperately want to be with them. And as a guide, I've tried to encourage such people who, when they're asleep the next night or the night after or the night after that, to not go back to their bodies and stay in spirit with their beloveds. And often their religious teachings will not let them do so because they feel it is tantamount to suicide. And I have even gotten into arguments with other retriever guides who think that what I'm doing is heretical, or what I'm suggesting is heretical. And I do not think it is. I think if people are so unhappy to be left on earth with their maybe not all, but most of their intimate families gone over due to the disaster, then they have every right to join them. But other guides do not see it that way. Anyway, another point. Continuing, here is the story of the father and the child I told you about yesterday. I was going to pass the story down through you. We were properly frightened when the fire started. That's a quote, by the way. There were two ways of reaching the children's wing. I went one way and my wife went the other. I soon realized there was very little hope unless someone had got the kiddies out already. But even that hope died when I got there and found the remains in a molten condition. I saw there was nothing to be done but to try and help anyone I could. I found 3 children sheltering behind a wall and slowly suffocating from the smoke. I told them to lie flat and crawl with me towards the passage that might still be untouched by fire. We reached the entrance and the way ahead seemed possible, but the fire was roaring over our heads, and as we reached the entrance a great beam or block of concrete fell on us. It was so sudden I was knocked out instantly, and so were the children. The next thing I knew, I found myself standing on top of the wreckage. It was burning furiously, but it didn't touch me, and one by one the children joined me and cowered close by. We were all standing on the glowing embers, but we weren't being burnt. I couldn't understand it. I didn't dare move as there was fire all around us, and the children were terrified. I wasn't somehow terrified, but this was all so strange. Some queer draft, I thought, had taken the heat from the spot where we were, and if we could only stay quite still, the fire might burn out, or rescuers reach us. And so I told the children to stay quite still and wait. We did so. The fire blazed, and we were all caught up in a strange way by the beauty of it, and out of the fire seemed to come shapes and forms and living people. Others joined us, seeing that we were unhurt, and we became quite a large group. Then suddenly we heard voices calling us. Don't be afraid. Walk out. Lift yourselves. You are free of the fire. We took no notice at first. How could we lift ourselves out of the fire? Then a girl of about 15 came up to me and said, "This is exciting. It's like astronauts walking in space. Have you tried it?" "Well, no," I said. "How can I?" "Like this," and she took my hand and seemed to be stepping into the air. Quite unconsciously I followed her, and so did the children who were clinging to me. We were all a bit light-headed when we found ourselves walking in the air over the fire and looking down into it. Someone said, "Don't look down, look up." I did so and saw a whole mass of people like ourselves actually walking on air. I thought, this is the strangest phenomenon. No doubt that it's some quite natural physical explanation of a gap in the gravitational pull caused by the fire. I was still very wary. I thought it might close in suddenly, and we should all fall down among the blazing ruins. So I took the children to hold on to me, and we would move as carefully as we could while this strange pocket of air held us, I hoped, until we were out of range of the burning building. We did so and moved quite easily. The current, as I supposed it was, seemed to be bearing us gently upwards. It was a very pleasant sensation. I was quite enjoying it, and so were the children. Then a stillness came upon us. The roar of the fire and the screams and shouts of the people died away, and we were alone in space. This was rather terrifying. What should I do next? We seemed to be quite a height above the ground. How could I get down safely with the children? Whenever I tried to drop down, my efforts were firmly resisted. I was growing desperate. Were we sailing off to the moon on some strange current of air? Then I began to hear voices telling me not to worry. I could see no one at this stage, and I thought I must be imagining things, or getting delirious. The children were quiet and looking confident. "Let yourself go, relax, you're in safekeeping," was shouted into my ear, and a short time after that I began to see we were in a large party, being escorted, if you can call it that, on and on into another layer of ether. I longed desperately to feel firm ground beneath my feet. "You will soon," said the same voice, and then my hand was seized by a firm grip, and before I knew what was happening, we were among trees and flowers and standing, as I'd hoped, on firm ground in some sort of garden. "Where on earth have we got to?" I asked. "Well, you'll see," said the voice. "It's not exactly on Earth anymore." Good heavens, what was the man saying? Had I gone mad? The children were delighted. They left me and were running wildly about, exploring the garden. They left me and were running wildly about, exploring the garden. Then suddenly in front of me I saw the form of a man. He seemed to grow into my vision, at first only a blurred object, which crystallized into a human form. "Who are you, and where am I?" asked in amazement. He was still gripping my hand. "Take it easy, son," he said. "You've passed over. You and the children have reached the next stage of living. You are now what the world calls dead." "Dead?" I screamed. "But we can't be." "No," he smiled. "There is no death." That was one of the many illusions that we all find on coming over. "But," I said, "if I'm dead, so are my wife and child. I know. I saw them." "They are no more dead than you," he said. "But at the moment they are sleeping off the exhaustion of this tremendous experience, and you and the children must do the same." I suddenly realized that I was dead beat. The children had already come back to me and were laying asleep like puppies on the ground. Laying asleep like puppies on the ground. "You seem to know all the answers," I heard myself saying weakly. And with that, I lay down and slept too. Another book, published in 1913, republished more recently, Letters from the Light, transcribed by the automatist Elsa Barker. Very good book, highly recommended, and in print and easy to get. Its chapters are divided into what he calls letters. There's letter number 22 from, what's the fellow's name again? David Patterson Hatch, who was a practicing judge and learned theosophist before he passed. So he had some notion of what he was going to when he died. And in this letter, he talks about the experience of doing automatic writing through Elsa Barker, and I think you will find this quite interesting. He calls this a brief for the defendants. "Tell the friend who is so anxious lest I do you harm by writing with your hand that the matter was thoroughly threshed out on this side between the teacher and me before it began to take form on your side. Ordinary mediumship, where the organism of a more or less unhealthy person on earth is opened indiscriminately for the entrance and obsession of any passing spirit, friendly or otherwise, is a very different proposition from this. Here I, who was your friend in the world, having passed beyond, reach back to instruct you from my greater knowledge on this side. I am not making any opening in your nervous system through which irresponsible forces can enter and take possession of you. In fact, if any spirit, amiable or harmful, should make such an attempt, he would have to reckon with me, and I am not powerless. I know now, have both remembered and been taught secrets by which I can protect you from what is generally known as mediumship. Furthermore, I advise you never, even at the urgent prayer of those whose loved ones have gone out, never to lend yourself to them. The wanderers in the so-called invisible world have no right to come and demand entrance through your organism, merely because it is so constituted that they could enter, any more than a street crowd would have the right to force its way into your home, merely because its members were curious, hungry, or cold. Do not allow it. Permission was once given, yes, but the case was exceptional and was not based on personal desire or curiosity of anybody, not even yourself. I doubt if permission will ever be granted again. Many things have changed since I began to write with you. At first I used your hand and arm from the outside, sometimes, as you remember, with such force as to make them lame the next day. Then, grown more familiar with the means at my disposal, I tried another method, and you noticed a large change in the character of my writing. It began clumsily, with large and badly formed characters, and gradually becoming clearer as my control of the instruments I was using was better established. Now, for the last few times I have used still another and third method. I enter your mind, putting myself in absolute telepathic rapport with your mind, impressing upon your mind itself the things I wish to say. In order to write in this way, You have to make yourself utterly passive, stilling all individual thoughts and yielding yourself to my thoughts. But that is no more than you do every day in reading a fascinating book. You can give your mind to the author who leads you along, rapt and passive, by the means of the printed page. And that is similar, that telepathic report, to what I experience with situations like Philip Seymour Hoffman and Robin Williams. Yes, it's similar enough. Quote, "These experiments in perfecting a way of communication have been very interesting to me. Tell your friend that I am not a child nor a reckless experimentalist. Not only in my last life on earth, but in many former lives, I have been a student of the higher science, giving myself absolutely to truth and to the quest for truth. I have never wantonly used any human being to his or her detriment, and I certainly shall not begin with you, my true friend and student. Nor shall I interfere in any way with your life or with your studies and work. The idea is nonsensical. When I walked in the world on 2 feet, I was never considered a dangerous man. I have not changed my character merely by changing my clothes and putting on a lighter suit. I have certain things to say to the world, and at present you are the only person who can act as an amanuensis for me. This is neither my fault nor yours. The question before us is not whether I want the letters written, or even whether you want to write them, but whether they will be beneficial to the world. I think they will. You think they may be. B thinks that they are not only immensely valuable, but unique. So-and-so and so-and-so have doubts and fears. I cannot help that, and neither can you. Bless their hearts. Why should they be so anxious to bolt the doors behind me? I shall certainly not try to run their affairs for them from this side. They are equal to the job, or they would not be able to hold it. But this is quite a different job which I have given myself, and you have kindly consented to. You may not get much reward for your labor, save the shake of the wiseacres' heads and their superior smiles, and the suggestion of the more scientifically inclined that I am your own subconscious mind. I shall not be offended by that hypothesis, nor need you. Of course you are not worried, for if you were, I could not write. Your mind has to be placid as a lake on a windless night in order for me to write at all. Give my love to them." Letters from the Light, Elsa Barker. Splendid little book. Anyway, a number of interesting points there. Things to ponder on until the next Afterlife of Average Folk. And until then, I wish you well. Love and blessings and all that good stuff.